You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your hosts, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management.
Welcome back to Habitat University, episode 2 of season 2, our exploration of private lands. And we're going to do something that I think is a little bit odd, actually. We said all we're going to do this season is talk about private lands. And basically, we define private lands in this country as those in which the federal government doesn't have an ownership stake, primarily. But the first person we're talking to on the private lands episode is a federal government employee. And that is because even though the federal government doesn't necessarily have ownership stakes in private lands, they have a rich tradition of helping private landowners do wildlife habitat management. And when we think about wildlife habitat management on private lands, we very quickly find the conversation goes to an alphabet soup of federal policies and programs. And we thought we better start there before we go through the rest of the season to make sure that we're all on the same page about what these programs are or are not, and how landowners can use them to achieve wildlife habitat goals on their property. So that's what we're up to today. Jared, do you want to welcome and introduce our guests from your home state?
We decided to bring on a guest today from Indiana. And this guest is Brianne Lowe, and she is the state biologist with NRCS, our first acronym. And so I'll let Brianne introduce herself and then describe our first acronym for us.
I am the state biologist for the USDA, so the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. So hopefully your listeners can see right away when we start using letters. That's a long job title there.
That's perfect. So, Bree, we kind of wanted just first to understand what a state wildlife biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service does. So could you just kind of introduce maybe your background and training and what it is that you do in your role with NRCS?
Absolutely. And it is a bit of a confusing title. And there is, in theory, one of me in every state and territory in the nation. So we are called the state biologist, which then sometimes gets us confused with state government biologists who serve a different role, who work for local Department of Natural Resources or whatever the local Fish and Wildlife Management Agency is. So it can be confusing, and I think it's good to clarify that up front. So as a state biologist, to step back a little, the Natural Resources Conservation Service deals with all natural resources, and wildlife and habitat being just one of them. And for our field staff, who would be the individuals working with our private landowners and your listeners, they need to know all the resources. They need to know all the things about each of the ways to conserve them and protect them. And so I serve as essentially a technical expert in wildlife that supports our field staff. So bringing the policies that come out of Washington down to the state level and helping get that information out onto the ground so it can be delivered to private landowners and making sure that we can get that there in a sound way. I got here as a trained wildlife biologist. I also have a degree from Purdue University in wildlife and a master's from Southern Illinois University's Cooperative Wildlife Research Lab, where I actually did my master's on private land wetland conservation. And from there, went to work as a private contractor doing some monitoring of wetland reserve easements, which maybe we'll talk about a little later, and wetlands on private lands, and then for the State Department of Agriculture and doing general conservation, and then into NRCS and various goals from there.
So, Brianne, you said that you serve as a technical expert for the field staff related to wildlife. So what does that look like on like a day-to-day basis? Like what kind of things are you involved with?
So the great thing about my job is that no one day looks the same. For our field staff, if there are questions on how to evaluate habitat, what types of practices might be suitable for a landowner, I am the lead point of contact that is going to give them the information they need to pass on to the landowner, to develop the materials that may be handed to a landowner to assist with the management. How do we recommend a planting? How do we recommend a site preparation or the management once the habitat is there? That is my role, is that educational component, that training component. I also develop the support tools. So how do we evaluate wildlife habitat here in Indiana? Well, we have guides for our staff to do that. And I support that with the expertise so that they can then take their schools and work with landowners to evaluate the habitat and other ways to support getting that habitat onto the ground. I also have the responsibility of working with our partner agencies like the DNR or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or DNR being the Department of Natural Resources, with specific such as threatened and endangered species. I'm the contact that would work with them if those types of wildlife are present on a property, so that we know that we're doing things that are going to positively benefit it and certainly not negatively. And so that is also my role as that liaison and point of contact.
So as you described that, it's popped in my mind that the state wildlife biologist with NRCS is like a very similar thing to the extension wildlife specialist with the university, right, Adam? Like a lot of the things that you described, Brianne, were things that Adam and I would do, right? Except for you can replace, the district conservationists in the NRCS world with extension educators in the extension world, providing that technical expertise to extension educators, the same way that you may provide technical expertise to field staff within NRCS.
Yeah, Jared, I was thinking that's an interesting comparison. And I bet then that, Bree, you have the same challenges we have with helping people understand what exactly we mean when we say wildlife habitat. So I'm wondering, we spent a lot of time in our last episode or our last season of our podcast defining wildlife habitat. I'm wondering, what's your approach to all of these, dozens, presumably, of county offices or regional offices that you work with, and all these specialists that probably some of them have some wildlife training and some don't. What are the challenges in your job getting people to understand wildlife habitat needs and implementing wildlife habitat on private lands?
Yeah, and that number is actually 92, Adam.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, that sounds challenging.
But thankfully, it's not. And part of that reason is we have dedicated conservationists who are interested in seeing conservation getting on the ground. So first and foremost, we're all coming from that same place. And we also have the private landowners that are coming into those offices and asking the questions. So really, where I see my role isn't that I'm trying to convince anyone one way or the other. I'm helping to do the translation. This landowner says they want this. They bring in all the resources they've looked up online. They have their different game group magazines and look at all these things I can do. And when our specialists look at that, it's overwhelming, right? And then I can come in and say, okay, let's see what we can do for here in where we are, which is Indiana, and talk them through the process. And here's the habitat. What food cover and shelter looks like. Let's look at that out on the landscape. Is it there or not? If it's not, what can we do to get it there? So I guess I feel like my role is the translator and getting people excited about doing that, which is probably the best part of my job, is getting people excited.
That's very interesting, and it seems like a really important role. I want to take a step back, like almost bigger picture. I started this whole episode with a mention of how it's a little bit ironic that when we're talking about private lands, the first person we visit with is a federal government employee. I'm curious, what's the big picture context? Like, why is the federal government even involved in wildlife habitat management, or why do these programs even exist, or why does the NRCS even exist? Thinking about like the historical legislation that established NRCS or the programs that you work with, what's sort of the big picture view of the role of the agency?
Absolutely. Let's see how far back we can take this. And I'm going to preface this by stating this is strictly the USDA side of it, so the Department of Agriculture side of that. That's where my familiarity is, and of course, all these private lands programs that I'm talking about, that's where they all originated. And I'm going to take it all the way back to the 1930s, and what many people are familiar with is the Dust Bowl, and that is where it all started for NRCS. Except at that time, it was the Soil Erosion Service, and then shortly renamed the Soil Conservation Service. So during that time frame, there were persistent drought conditions in the Great Plains area. So out west and a little bit to the southwest, although it was present nationwide as well. And the persistent dust storms, including one that swept not only across the Great Plains, but drove a huge cloud of dust across the U.S. and onto the East Coast and even onto D.C. and out the Atlantic Ocean, really brought to light the challenges that were occurring out in this part of the country, and the recognition that if we continued to lose soil at the rate we were losing it at the time, it would be very hard to continue to be sustainable in producing feed and fiber on that land. And so that ultimately led to the formation of the Soil Conservation Service. Really the idea of protecting fertile soil and clean water. Otherwise, as a nation, we really couldn't survive. And so that seems crazy to talk about that in the context of wildlife. So just bear with me a little bit on this, as we're going to fast forward several decades from then. So our agency worked with local groups on that soil and water conservation, working with those private landowners, all of this voluntary, the practices you could do to protect soil and water resources. But we go through several decades and we get into the 80s. And this is a time, again, where there's another farming crisis. And to respond to that, the Congress passed the Food Security Act of 1985, which is now known as the Farm Bill. And it had provisions in there, including something called sodbuster, with the breaking of new ground for farming, swamp buster, which is to protect wetlands when farming was involved, and some other programs to protect highly erodible land. Again, the soil conservation side of it. It's a big program that really came on the scene for wildlife at that time with the protection of that highly erodible land was the Conservation Reserve Program, or our next acronym of the day, CRP. And CRP provided rental payments to farmers for putting croplands into grasses or trees. And it becomes the start of that federal financial support for wildlife habitat. At that time, and you'll still hear people reference it as the set-aside program. And so that's really where we see the start of it. And as we move forward, the popularity of it, the effectiveness of it, the response of wildlife to those types of programs has been continued and led to even greater emphasis on wildlife habitat in this landscape. And what now we can even say that NRCS is participating in projects that we now term restoration. So we see in 1994 the Wetland Reserve Program coming on the scene, and that's where we start protecting wetlands on a permanent basis and getting that habitat out on the landscape.
Brianne, can you maybe describe some of the ways that, since the creation of the Farm Bill, that it's become like more tailored towards creating habitat for various wildlife species? or some of the changes that maybe you've seen over your career?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So one thing that I think is a big important part of discussing this change is I mentioned the development of the Wetland Reserve Program is part of the transition in 1994. And actually, 1994 is when we became known as the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that is a big date of transition for our agency. That's when the recognition became we're not just about soil erosion. We're not just about clean water. We're going to look at all these natural resources because they're all intertwined. So we have the soil component. We have the water conservation component. We're also looking at air quality. What can we do for that? We also look at plants as conservation, in terms of conservation. Those that we plant ourselves and those that are wild and in nature, as well as the animal component of conservation, both the domestic animals that we raise on our farms as well as the wildlife. And even more recently, we've added human and energy as resource concerns that we address as an agency. And so when we became the Natural Resource Conservation Service, it allowed us to become more integrated in how we address wildlife habitat on private land. It allows us to work with the private landowner on how all of these different factors intertwine. So healthy soil and clean water not only has agronomic implications for a farm operation, but it also has implications to the fish in the stream and the wildlife in the landscape and wildlife habitat on the other side of that equation, although is through its permanent vegetation helps to hold the erodible land in place as well as filter water before it enters the streams. We see forest management became a big component of what we do. And so what's good for timber production and managed appropriately can also be very good for the birds. And so what we've seen as even during my time here over the last 16 years is moving from just here's the problem, here's the solution to let's integrate how all of this works together and make for that stable system on the landscape.
That's really interesting. And it's something that I think a lot of us from outside the agency really admire, your capacity to integrate across multiple different disciplines and then ultimately to have this presence, like you said, in Indiana, 92 county offices to help all these diffuse private landowners make these conservation decisions and to help steward public wildlife and water resources. It's a really neat outcome. What we were going to do next is we wanted to dig deeper on a couple of programs and kind of ask you to help us break it down. Like, what is the actual experience with a program for a private landowner? And so what we thought we would do is start with CRP. You've already introduced CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, and this is definitely probably the highest profile. I was looking here at some statistics I have in the first 30 years of the CRP following its passage in 1985 or its creation in 1985. 37 million acres of rented acres on highly erodible land, 1.5 trillion pounds of soil prevented from being lost, 85% reduction in phosphorus runoff, 95% reduction in nitrate loss or nitrogen loss, 170,000 miles of streams and rivers with riparian buffers, 200 or almost 300,000 acres of wetlands restored through the Conservation Reserve Program. It's like a really remarkable national impact on private lands. And so it's the big one, as we say. And so what we want to ask you is to help break down this program for us. Basic stuff like, first, who's eligible to have CRP, or what do those land acres look like, and how do people get enrolled? For example, how did we get those 37 million acres enrolled across the country through the use of those NRCS offices?
Oh, okay. Well, CRP, who is eligible? So CRP is eligible on the active croplands. Each Farm Bill, and I guess to step back a little, the Farm Bill is negotiated and reauthorized approximately every 5 years. And so each farm bill then assigns to it what crop acres are essentially eligible. And it's more tied to it hasn't been farmed or not. And so I say this for your listeners because this is something that when you go into a local office, the Farm Service Agency is going to look at that particular piece of ground and determine has it been farmed for in the last 5 years or whatever the span of years that they're going to look at as defined by that farm bill. That land had to be an active production. So it is for crop ground. And then there are two different forms of CRP, which then kind of makes this a little more intricate in how we determine eligibility. So there is continuous CRP. This, a landowner can enroll at any time, and this is to address urgent resource concerns. And many of it is to address erosion and water quality concerns. So if there is a gully in a field, we may see someone come in to enroll a draft waterway to prevent further erosion. And those can be enrolled continuously. Then there is also general sign up. And there are a few, I should step back and say, there are a few practices, such as the quail border practice, known as CP33, so an acronym and a number there. That is a continuous sign up that can be enrolled at any time. And then there is also our pollinator efforts, which are also pollinator habitat can be enrolled at any time through continuous CRP. When we then get into what is general CRP, this is a more competitive process. There is limited sign up. In fact, we'll be coming up on a general sign up here in the next couple of weeks. And that will be hopefully announced soon. And that will, the landowner enrolls it, talks about the practices they'd like to see on the ground. There's a lot more wildlife options in this particular type of enrollment, but there are a number of factors that get weighted into that decision. How erodible the land is, what type of cover you're going to put on the ground, what are some other conservation values that will happen out there. So it does become competitive. Not every offer is accepted, but once enrolled, then you can have a 10 to 15 year contract, depending on the practice, to install that habitat. And there is, from FSA, the Farm Service Agency, an annual rental payment.
Okay, so those different types of CRP, the continuous and general, those are, you mentioned this other acronym and a number, the conservation practices, or CPs. I was looking, and we'll put this in the show notes, there's 43 of those CPs now. What's the history of some of those conservation practices, and to what extent does a landowner need to actually be aware of what conservation practice they want to enroll in or not? What's that look like?
To know what to enroll in, I think it's more important to step back and let's just talk about what the goals are for the landowner. What are we trying to get on the landscape? So you're interested in putting habitat on the ground, and you have it part of the farm where I think was discussed in a previous episode that maybe it is not as productive. Maybe it is a highly erodible area and we'd like to get some permanent vegetation on it. Now the discussion becomes, what would you like to see there? If it's quail, then we might be looking at a very specific type of grass cover out there, and there's a practice for that. It would be the native cover, or maybe some native cover mixed with some shrubs. If it's pollinators, which of course is the big buzz right now, and we're seeing a growing interest, then we go into one of the more detailed practices that are out there. So that's something, the Conservation Practice 42, which has been available for, I think, about 10 years now. So it's new-ish, sort of, in the grand scheme of things, but that one has very specific requirements, but it's going to target those pollinators out there. If it's more just overall prairie habitat, 43 is a very new one, and that's very stripped out in the field. So it needs to be very much tied to the goals. And if a landowner isn't quite even sure what those resource concerns or goals are, then that's something to work with your local conservationist to talk through. And then we can assist in helping find a practice that will address the goals. It's nobody should feel that they have to know exactly what practices they want and will fit their land exactly. If when we're here to provide the technical assistance to kind of walk through that decision-making process of what do you have, where do you want to go, and how can we get there?
So among those 43 conservation practices, what types of vegetative communities or cover types could be created through that, right? Are we talking mainly like native warm season grass and forb stands, or more broad, what practice you enroll in?
There's quite a wide range of cover, and there's several of those practices that are not going to be very well suited for wildlife. They are highly focused on the soil erosion, water quality side of that. So when we get into the wildlife habitat practices, maybe looking at CP2 or a CP4 wildlife habitat, we're looking at either native cover, so the native grasses and native shrubs, native forbs out there. In some instances, we may see the use of introduced grasses that may be appropriate in some instances, but those are going to be grasses that are still very beneficial for wildlife habitat. Not all introduced grasses are, as we know. One in particular, fescue, can be quite problematic for many of our wildlife species to thrive in. But we do have a number that do work, and so that is an option if that's the appropriate solution for setting. But many of especially the newer conservation practices, such as the pollinator habitat or these prairie strips, are going to be looking at highly diverse, using native grasses and wildflowers as well as lagoons to create as diverse and stable plant communities as possible on the landscape, and doing that in the locations on the farm that is suitable. There are also several tree planting practices that are available through CRP as well. So we talk so much about the grassland side. That is for my state where my specialty is, but we do have a number of forestry practices in CRP as well. So if you're interested in the restoration of bottomland hardwoods, or to get some fence rows back with some windbreaks and potential, there are tree planting practices as well that can bring that habitat in by looking at hardwood species that provide the hard mass for food sources for wildlife and the cover that is necessary for thermal protection as well.
That's really cool, and certainly a exciting mechanism to get a lot of wildlife habitat on the landscape. The next question is something totally outside of the typical wildlife conversation, but of course really important as we think about compelling private actors to do this stuff, and that's the dollars and cents of these programs. So what does it look like for a farmer or a landowner to enroll in the CRP? How are they compensated? What do they have to pay for? How are those payments structured? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
The CRP is a program that comes with a yearly rental payment. So that is one of the enticing parts of the program for sure. In that, especially if we're taking some of this low productive ground out of production, there is this annual compensation that comes with that. And these contracts are for 10 to 15 years, depending on the practice and the landowner interest. And then that rental payment comes on a per acre basis every year. What that rental payment is varies by every county. It's based on local soil types and yield conditions for the soil in your particular field. So that does vary. And so I can't give you specific dollars in that regard. But in addition to that, when first enrolled, there is assistance through cost share to get the practice on the ground. So the Farm Service Agency will provide a portion of the cost of the practice, and then sometimes maybe other incentive payments that come depending on the practice. complicated math in different ways, but there is an expectation that the government will provide some funds to assist in the implementation or putting that practice on the ground, and the landowner will also contribute to that as well. So part of the cost for the seed, for instance, will be paid for by both the landowner and the government.
We've heard a little bit about how maybe these practices may be used to benefit wildlife within CRP, and then why it may make financial sense. What is some other information that you think is important for landowners to know if they want to go into CRP?
CRP does come with the expectation of management and maintenance as well. And of course, depending on which practice you do, what that looks like can vary. So one thing that I think is important, especially when we talk about the wildlife habitat side, is that it's not always as simple as plant and walk away. So one expectation I would definitely emphasize is when you want this habitat, when you want to see pollinator habitat on the landscape, it is not just plant the seed and then you get 10 to 15 years of just getting to watch it bloom and walk away. And CRP has the expectation that after the habitat is established, you will do and are required to do at least 1 to 3 years of management. It kind of varies on the size and the type of habitat is, and working with a local biologist on how to best do that management, whether that is a prescribed fire or maybe strip disking or an interseeding to add additional diversity. There is an expectation with the program that happens. And there's also an expectation that cover be maintained for the life of our contract. So it does come with responsibility on the part of the landowner that is signed up. But the flip side of that is that active involvement in the habitat can bring great enjoyment, and you can see some really positive results by continuing to ensure that cover stays out there.
So you covered a lot about CRP and different aspects. And so Adam and I are we may just randomly fire off some acronyms at you and have you explain what those mean. I think the perfect time, this is the perfect time for this acronym, and it's the acronym SAFE or SAFE. So what is SAFE and how does it fit within CRP?
Oh, the acronym too continues on. So SAFE stands for State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement. And it is a part of the CRP program. In that instance, it's actually a really cool partnership between state Fish and Wildlife agencies and then the USDA, and specifically the Farm Service Agency. So states know best what they need for the wildlife on the landscape. They know where in the state the habitat is needed the most. They know what types of cover is needed, which species are in most decline. And so when the opportunity for the State Acres for Wildlife program came on board, it's a chance for the states to submit proposals to say, we want to see CRP placed into the landscape in these locations for this specific species using these specific practices. It's a very similar structure, and it's identical structure to the rest of the CRP. They tend to be whole field practices. So some of the things I mentioned earlier, like the EP33 quail border practice, it's a border practice. It's strip around the outside of the field. SAFE offers that opportunity to do a whole field habitat practice, and it is very much targeted to what is needed in the individual states. And so it becomes this great partnership where we see the Fish and Wildlife agencies providing that technical knowledge. Their biologists are working with the landowners and combining it with the benefits that CRP offers through the Farm Bill.
Yeah, and they're like really state specific, right? So like I think what he read off some of the ones that are in Indiana, there's like, one for bobwhite and woodcock and maybe a few other species. So they're like really fit to meet the needs that's going on in that state, right?
Yes, it is very targeted for specific species within the state. And those were even recently, in the last 2 years, revamped again. So yes, it's a good time to go back and look. If this is something someone has pursued in the past and maybe their county wasn't covered in the past by a SAFE, depending on where they are in the nation, they may be now, as all the states resubmitted proposals recently. So we saw a shifting here in Indiana of some of those species and the counties that those species were supported in. So it's a good time to even revisit if it's something that people want to consider.
So another one of these state level programs, I think, is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. And that's nested underneath CRP, correct? Could you tell us a little bit about what CREP is?
So the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program is not the same, but kind of similar to what I just described with the state acres for wildlife, in that with the enhancement program, again, the state agency, it can differ in different states, as I understand it. I can speak to Indiana that we work with the Indiana State Department of Agriculture on our CREP program. And there's a very strong emphasis on the water quality side of it, and that can include habitat. So certainly with my experience with it here is that often results in some wetland restoration. There's obviously a lot of wildlife benefit that comes from wetland restoration, but it also addresses that water quality resource concern. So again, we're seeing though that leveraging of the state resources and funds with the federal, and when you get that combination together and that technical support together, you really see a boost in how much conservation can be delivered on the ground.
Okay, that's really cool. Those partnerships like that are interesting, and it seems like a really important part of NRCS's work. And yeah, the CREP out here is also wetland focused. And I know the state between Iowa and Indiana is Illinois, and it's wetland focused there. And then I've seen CREPs in other states that are focused on upland practices related to water. Ohio has a really interesting CREP program and that's benefited pheasants, I know. South Dakota, the same way, that created wildlife open access actually for hunting on private lands through their CREP program. And the James River Valley in Kentucky is a really good example too that I think we're going to learn about in a little bit. A later episode of the podcast this season where their CREP has had really positive impacts on both water in their karst landscape and northern bobwhites, which are near and dear to the Habitat University podcast listeners' heart. So we like that.
All right, so we have one more acronym for you related to CRP, then we'll move on. So MCM.
MCM. That is actually an outdated acronym, Bird.
Oh, wow.
I'm glad you let us know.
Yes, it is now MA. So MCM, which many of us who have been around forever still call it, would be the mid-contract management. So when I talked earlier about the expectations of the landowner with their CRP contracts and doing some level of management down the line after the habitat is established to make sure that habitat stays there. I mean, if we're committing both private and government resources to getting the habitat on the ground, we want to see it managed. And so there is that management component to it. MCM, or mid-contract management, was the old acronym for what practices had to be done in that mid part of your 10 to 15-year contract to maintain that habitat. With the most recent Farm Bill, the 2018 version of the Farm Bill, it is no longer mid-contract management, and it is MA, or management activities. Same basic concept and principle, but the acronym.
Okay, so you got me up to date on MCM, which is now MA, and another acronym related to CRP that I think is important to mention is FSA. So what is FSA?
FSA stands for the Farm Service Agency. So that is actually a sister agency to the Natural Resources Conservation Service within USDA. And if we want to get even more into the acronyms, FPAC is the Food Production and Conservation Division of USDA. And so both NRCS and the Farm Service Agency fall under that. And Farm Service Agency manages CRP. So it is it is their program. And NRCS comes into this. You've been asking me all the questions when really it is a Farm Service Agency program. But NRCS, we provide the technical guidance. So when a landowner walks into a service center where they might want to get enrolled in something like CRP, they're going to talk to the Farm Service Agency first, but they're going to be referred to NRCS, who will then walk the farm with them, talk through the resource needs with them, and talk about how to implement CRP on their ground from that technical side. But the program management side is completely in the Farm Service Agency's realm. So it's an important agency to be familiar with.
Okay. More alphabet soup. That's the nature of this episode, I think. And I think I'm keeping up, and I got a running tally of them. But here's one that I actually admittedly am not all that familiar with, because it kind of came along after I had been hanging around NRCS offices. And it's a more recent, I think it's enveloped some older acronyms that I'm more familiar with. So Bree, what is ACEP, ACEP?
The Agriculture Conservation Easement Program. And you are correct that it did absorb some other acronyms that you probably were familiar with. So I mentioned earlier, back in 1990s, NRCS took on the responsibility of the Wetland Reserve Program. So that was WRP. We're gonna hit all the acronyms right now.
Perfect.
There was another conservation program available at the same time, called FRPP, or Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program. Then, right around, I believe, the 2008 Farm Bill, we're going to say early 10s, basically, of 2000s, those two programs actually got rolled into what is the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. So it is the overarching easement program for NRCS now. So these are all programs NRCS manages. And both that ag land side of it, so doing permanent easements to protect agricultural land in perpetuity or for long duration, is in there. And that's to keep those productive lands productive in farming. And it also has underneath it the Wetland Reserve Easement. So WRP became WRE when it got rolled into the ACEP. So similar concept to what it was before, probably back when you knew it. WRE does permanent wetland protection. Any land that has been farmed that is hydric is eligible for the WRP program. So these typically are areas that flood out regularly, whether it's a pothole type wetland, an emergent wetland out on landscape, or somewhere in a floodplain system. If that is hydric soil that has been cropped, it is eligible. And then we will also are able to enroll the surrounding buffer that comes with that. Sometimes it's called other land, essentially. And we can match that hydric crop ground acreage with a 1-to-1 match of either upland habitat, because that's always important for wetland systems. We can match that with maybe existing habitat on that same property. So that became a program to take this unproductive wet ground out of production, put it back into habitat, support migratory waterfowl and other migratory birds, and it has an easement on it. And that's where that E and really every one of those acronyms comes from, is that there is actually an easement written into the deed that says this ground is going to stay this way, either for a 30-year duration or in perpetuity. Sometimes it depends on your interest and how long you, as the landowner, want that to be on there. And then some states have limitations on how long that can be. But some of them are permanent. That's what in perpetuity means. And some are 30 years in life.
Okay, and it's that easement that distinguishes this from CRP. CRP and WRE may look similar, but WRE has an intent for a much longer time horizon than CRP. That's the biggest distinction?
That is probably the biggest distinction in terms of that duration. So CRP does, in theory, have an end. As long as there continues to be Farm Bill, an opportunity to re-enroll, someone can re-enroll their Conservation Reserve Program acres when they get to the end of the contract. There's a process to do that if everything is in good condition. With WRE, when you enroll, there is a payment that comes with that. There is an easement payment. So you are compensated for losing the ability to just do whatever to the land. So there is an easement payment. There is the support to put the practices on the ground, similar to CRP. there is financial support to restore that wetland, so that it is actually 100% in many cases. If it's especially for permanent easements, it's 100% support to restore that habitat. But that is a permanent fixture then on the property. If you sell the ground, the easement goes with it. If you divide the ground, that easement still stays with it on WRE. So it's very important, and that becomes a different consideration as well. That's a long time. Forever is a long time. So it is a bigger commitment that when you are aware and know your land well enough to know that this is what that land is trying to do. It is trying to return to those wetland conditions. It works really well for many of our participants to say, let's get this back to the habitat that it's trying to be, that wetland out there.
Okay. So maybe you said this and I missed it, but is there an annual payment associated with a WRE easement? Or is it just the upfront, purchase of the easement?
It is just the upfront purchase of the easement. And it is related, and it's related into its real estate value. There's, in some states, it kind of depends on where you are in the country. In some states, you could go online and look at what's called a geographic area rate cap. So your county might have a number that it will offer you per acre. In other parts of the country, especially maybe where enrollment's a little lower, you may actually get an appraisal done on the ground that looks at what is the value of it now and what is the value after you have an easement on it, and there's some compensation for that change in value that comes with the easement. But it is a one-time upfront sum payment for the easement.
Yeah, the WRE is how I knew it back in my day as a farm bill biologist and our neighbor to the south. But it was a really cool program. I got to spend a lot of time on different easements in Kentucky, and it's a really cool program that has a lot of wildlife benefits. And one of the coolest things was we had several easements that, some really cool species like whooping cranes made use of those easements. Can you talk about maybe some cool examples of how WRE or WRP, as it used to be known, has been utilized in Indiana?
Oh, yes. And whooping cranes is probably near the top of the list. We have some of the most frequent visits to our WRP sites by whooping cranes of any of the states with WRP or WRE. I'll probably continue to call it WRP just because that's what most people still know it as we talk here. Here in Indiana, we actually have a very robust enrollment in WRE statewide, and we have seen some very large parts of the state enrolled. We have some multi-thousand acre easements. So WRE provides this opportunity to get some very large-scale habitat on the ground. And as a result, we're seeing species return to the state that we just didn't see before. So you mentioned whooping crane. One of our easements is a frequent stopover for the white pelican, not specifically an endangered species, but one that wasn't frequently observed prior to kind of these wetlands being put back on the landscape, because we see these WRP easements popping up in pockets where once one landowner enrolls it, their neighbors get excited about what they see on the landscape, so they enroll their land, because usually these wetlands are occurring all in a chain on a riverway here in Indiana. We get these large stretches of wetlands to get linked up together, and as a result, it has a tendency to attract more of the migratory birds as they come through. So it's been phenomenal to see that bird response as we continue to add acres in Indiana, and how just by being able to connect all that habitat in a big way and not necessarily individual little patches, but just big swaths of habitat all add up. But each of those big swaths is made up of individual landowners making that decision to put the habitat on the landscape, which is a really cool factor with that program.
That is a really cool practice. So a couple of just lingering questions on this WRE easement, just to help us understand. One, we want to understand, how do those landowners get enrolled? Kind of like we talked for CRP, there's the continuous and general for CRP. Is there anything like that for WRE, or is it just walk in the NRCS office door? And then our other question is, once they sell the easement, what can they still do or not do on that land that has the easement applied to it?
So this program is managed by NRCS. So you will be walking into the NRCS door. That is always the first place to start. And I should go ahead and say that you can find your local office on the web. It is every office is on there. It'll have the contact number for your local district conservationist. So if you don't already have a relationship with either your Farm Service Agency or NRCS locally, you can find your office nearby. So every county in the U.S. is represented. It may not be an office in your county, but it'll be very close by. So just to begin with that. But yes, walking through the door to NRCS and expressing your interest. And what ultimately we're going to start asking is, first, we do need to see proof of ownership. You do need to own that ground, and you need to have owned it for, I do believe the time period now is 2 years. So to show that commitment to the land and how long you've had it in this possession. We're then going to look at the eligibility of the land itself. And so I mentioned that it's that hydrate crop ground, or that hydrate agricultural ground. It could be pasture as well. I don't want to discount that it could be other forms of agriculture, but it has to have had some agricultural history, and it needs to be that hydrate wetland condition. So we're going to look at the soil maps and aerial imagery and some of the past farming records to see, does it meet that criteria? Is it even eligible to be in the program? And then we're going to come out and walk the ground with you and talk to you about, what are you seeing in terms of flooding and what we call the hydrology, or how the water is behaving on the ground. Is it flooding? Is it just a sort of a moist soil system? What's going on out there? What is your drainage? Do you have it out there? Is it something that we can disable? If we're going to restore wetlands, we have to be able to do that. And if the drainage isn't going to allow us. So we're going to start working with you on, how is that land eligible? Can we, not only was it historically a wetland, are we able to get it back to that condition? And then also looking at the surrounding areas. Do we want to add some uplands to that to meet the goals? What type of vegetation will be put out there? And so all of that is done in most cases and in most states with a WRP ranking team. So a team of a local conservationist, maybe one of our local biologists, and other scientists and engineers potentially will go out and evaluate the site and do a ranking of the site to see if it is eligible for enrollment and how it would be successful in becoming that habitat. And then that program, or that application and that ranking, get put into the pot. The goal to look at who ranks out the highest. And every year, NRCS, each state gets an allocation from Congress on how much money to put in each program. And so each state gets that dollar amount for all of our conservation programs. And the competitive part of that process is with the ranking, who ranks out the highest, and we start funding at the top and work our way through the finances and the budget that we have. At that point, if that program has the money for your particular property and you are accepted in the program, then begins the process of not only sort of that real estate side of it, the easement side of it, but also the planning on how are we going to get that wetland back and doing that planning process. And so that can be multi-month to potentially a multi-year process, depending on how complicated all of that is.
Bree, what about restrictions once the easement goes in place?
And the restrictions are something that everyone needs to be taking into consideration when looking for an easement. So we talked about this is forever, and that is a tremendous commitment for anyone. CRP is that 10 to 15 years, but at that end of that 15 years, you have the option to either do something different with your land or re-enroll it. WRE, it is forever, and it is fairly restrictive. And so you retain ownership of the ground. So one misconception is because it's a federal easement on it that it's suddenly public ground, and that is not true. It is entirely private. All access can be controlled by the landowner, and so that is retained. You retain the right to quiet enjoyment of the easement, and it sounds kind of funny, but really what that means is non-developed recreation. So you can hunt, you can fish, you can bird watch on the property, you can hike, you can picnic, all of those things that we consider quiet enjoyment. It is not to be used for, say, recreational vehicle uses out there. It's not to become a racetrack of any sort in that regard. So it's not, it needs to remain habitat. There are also rights that are retained in terms of you're able to retain some water rights and some mineral rights that are out there. So if that is something that is present in your part of the country, I would recommend working with your local office on how that all plays out. The things you don't get to do are you're not going to get to top it again. So if that's an important aspect of it for you, then this is probably not the program of choice. You are not going to get to build a house on it. There's limitations on what you can do with timber. So if you have a wooded WRE site, the timber rights are not necessarily going to still be there. So don't assume that you're going to be able to continue to harvest the timber. Everything you do at that point is going to be based on what is the habitat for the site. There will be minimal trails and access points to it. So we're not going to be paving anything out there. It's truly to try to get it back to that wetland habitat condition. So those are definitely important considerations when considering whether or not to put something that permanent on your deed. That being said, there's a lot of merit to that as well. There are opportunities to do other things on the easement, something like food plots. That is a crop. Some people prefer to use some food plots, especially some of our hunters would like to see some out there. That, in some cases, depending on each individual state situation, may be authorized through what's called a compatible use authorization. So that's where you as the landowner could come to NRCS and say, I want to do these things on my property. Maybe I want to do some timber management, or I want to put a trail in, or I want to do a food plot. There is a process to apply for that after the easement's on the property. All I can say is that there's never a guarantee that compatible use will be authorized. So I think it's just highly advised to take into consideration that there is a strong limit on what you can do on the property, but it is still your property and you still can access it and use it for wildlife purposes.
So just to take that a little further, and I know, so you talked about the compatible use agreements. So there is the opportunity to do various habitat management activities given the approval and it fits the property, right? So there you can do things like do more soil management if you're interested in waterfowl, so maybe some water manipulation, or if you have some uplands, things like prescribed fire and those sorts of activities to kind of manage the habitat in a way that's going to promote whatever wildlife species you're interested in or are using the property.
Yes, absolutely, and encouraged and applied through that process. It is to the benefit of the property and that habitat and both the landowner and NRCS to have that property managed for habitat as best as possible. It's just really hard to say, sitting here in Indiana, what the ideal compatible use is somewhere else in the nation. So it's hard to generalize what would be approved, where, when, and for how long. But yes, any kind of habitat management would go through that process and would need to be suitable for the local wetland type.
That's all some really good information about the program. I think there's a lot of opportunities with WRE. I think it's one of those programs where you really have to do some considerations on what your long-term plans are with the property. So we're going to throw another acronym at you, and we're going to we've been talking about programs that are pretty specific to lands that are in agricultural production or that have been agricultural production. And so maybe this acronym will get us on some other types of land that may not deal exactly with agricultural production. So the one I'm going to throw out is EQIP.
EQIP is our Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So this is one of NRCS's actually largest programs out there, and it does deal in general with a lot of agricultural practices. So it can be overwhelming if you get online and start to research what it is, because it covers every resource concern NRCS deals with. But from a habitat standpoint, we are looking at not only agricultural ground or maybe the associated ag land, or sort of the side lands, lands that don't have any particular ag use, might be just growing up in some old field weeds or just an odd corner here and there. We could be talking about that, or we could be talking about the cropland itself, or something, I'm throwing out a whole nother set of terms here, is non-industrial private forest ground. So this is the forest land that private landowners have that's not dedicated to a specific industrial company. So it sounds kind of weird to say non-industrial private forest ground, but really that's just your landowner's woodlands. And so this program can help with resource concerns across any of those land uses. And EQIP itself has a number of habitat opportunities in it, whether it is planting wildlife habitat planting on the landscape that might look like a grassland, whether that's doing a tree and shrub planting to do some forest restoration in terms of from the planting side of things. It could be some riparian buffers, and it can also be the forest management as well. So how do we manage the forest in a way that keeps those forests productive, regenerating, and good for wildlife as well? So it's really broad scale, and it's much shorter term. So you mentioned that the WRE comes with some commitment, long-term and forever commitments with it, and CRP comes with some shorter, but still pretty long-term commitments with it. Sometimes EQIP might fit better into a landowner's long-term goals of let's get some assistance and get some habitat on the ground, but do that in a shorter time frame.
You talked a little about habitat practices. So if we go into the woods, maybe since this program allows you to kind of do different management in the woods and such, what kind of opportunities are there for those landowners that may not own any agricultural land, but they own that non-industrial forest land?
So for the forest landowners, first and foremost, I will say what practices or what within those practices, what types of scenarios are offered through EQIP, or scenarios you drilling down within that practice. So in a forest land setting, it might be the level of which you're going to do some forest stand improvement. That varies state to state. So definitely, and maybe even within the state. So definitely working with your local office is the first place to go. But some opportunities include, walking through. We do have NRCS foresters in the state. Sometimes we have a state forester, sort of my counterpart, or even area foresters who can go out there, walk with you, look at your forest resources, and decide, do we need to do some oak regeneration out there? That is a big driving initiative right now, getting more oak and hickory on the landscape. And as we know, oak and hickory feed wildlife, and so that's an important component. It could be, do we need to start doing some forest openings to do that? So getting some of the light to the ground and generating some of those trees. It could just be invasive species management. So we have practices that allow for the treatment of either brushy cover, moving in with those invasive species, and there's some pervasive species as well that can be addressed, again, depending on where you are in the nation. There are opportunities for what we call forest stand improvement. Many people call it timber stand improvement, CSI, so that we can also be looking at that long-term timber income as well. NRCS is not involved with the harvest of trees for sale. That is not what we do, but we will work with you on how do we address the resource concerns for that forest productivity in the long term. How can we look at that long-term investment into conservation, which also affects the wildlife.
So you mentioned some of the habitat opportunities that are available through EQIP, and I think you made the takeaway I took from that is since it's like the other ones, it's a national program. So what EQIP practices, especially wildlife practices or forestry practices, are available in your state is going to vary greatly. But I have two questions. First one is there like a minimum amount of money that gets set aside for wildlife related practices? And then two, how does the financial structure of EQIP work from a landowner's perspective? We have the set aside program like CRP that you get an annual rental payment. What does that look like from the EQIP side?
So the dollar amount that gets set aside for EQIP every year obviously varies by farm bill and what's allocated. But from wildlife, because wildlife has become such an important component of the Environmental Quality Use Incentives Program, it's an important driver of why many of our landowners walk through the door. There is a requirement nationally that 10% of EQIP funds be used for wildlife. And that is a very significant chunk. And that is for everything from wetland restoration, which sometimes people use EQIP to do the wetland restoration, to the wildlife plantings, to if there's forest management that's being done for wildlife, it could include that as well. So it's a sizable consideration out there. One thing with EQIP is it does come with, as I said, the financial assistance. That, again, can vary a little bit, but you would estimate that to be anywhere from 50 to 75% of the practice implementation amount. It does vary, obviously, by location and all the economic factors that come with that. But it does not come with those annual payments. It does not come with an easement payment. So it is just assistance to apply the practice and get it on the ground, and then the technical assistance on how you do that, and then any support you would need afterwards to continue that habitat to the future. I will add, all of these programs we talk about are fantastic, but if all you are interested in is just getting some ideas for what you want to do on your land, NRCS is here to provide technical assistance. We call it the other acronym nobody knows about at all, and it's the CTA, and that's that Conservation Technical Assistance. So there's never a need to feel that there has to be a commitment to any of these programs. We will talk to you and work with you on your conservation resource needs for free, and come out there and give you our suggested advice, and you can use that or not, and that's fine too.
Okay, Bree. So at the beginning of the show, you said you were the only wildlife biologist, or you were the state wildlife biologist for NRCS. But then now you're saying you'll go, someone from NRCS can go walk anybody's farm and help them think about some things that they could do to address soil or timber or wildlife conservation priorities. So help us understand a little bit more about who all is involved in implementing all of these programs that we just spent all this time talking about. Like who are these people in the NRCS offices and other partners?
There are so many of us, isn't there? So in Indiana, I am the only biologist with NRCS. There are some states that may have area biologists, so they just focus on a region of the state, but that varies greatly. So the truth is, we just can't do all this wildlife work without our partners, and really any of our conservation work without our partners. So honestly, looping back to our very first conversation, since day one back in the 30s in the Dust Bowl, NRCS has partnered with local groups and agencies all along. So it started out with the local soil and water districts. You have one where you are. How they're organized differs state to state. It might be by watershed. It might be in your county. Sometimes those local soil and water districts have biologists or ecologists on staff to assist with walking the land and evaluating the habitat. We then look at it from our partnerships with the state government. So we often have a state biologist. So it's confusing because my title state biologist, but there are state government biologists or the DNR or Fish and Wildlife divisions that also have biologists in many of the counties in a state, and they will work directly with NRCS and deliver these conservation programs and that technical assistance I just talked about and help provide that guidance. You also now see more and more of the conservation groups or non-governmental organizations getting involved. We have partnerships and agreements with groups like Pheasants Forever and National Wild Turkey Federation, American Conservation Experience, Frost Society. I'm going to forget somebody if I keep going down this list, so I can only speak to those we work with here, but any of those conservation groups work with NRCS may have what they will term a farm bill biologist or a partner biologist, either located in our office or located regionally, that can assist with the landowners. And it's that partnership effort that really makes this possible. We spewed out all the alphabet soup of acronyms out there, all the programs, how all their rules are a little bit different and who's eligible and what habitat needs. And it's these specialists that can actually be there on the ground with you as the landowner to hear what your needs are, your goals are, and fit that into the ecology of the area and make that possible.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. It's actually the whole reason we wanted to start this private land season with you, Bree, is because it occurs to us that no matter who else you talk to, things almost always come back to connecting to cost share opportunities that NRCS or FSA provides. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to kind of give us the foundational understanding of some of the big programs. It's not lost on us that we've been talking for quite some time now, and we've definitely missed a couple of other acronyms that are important, but we want to sort of start to wrap the show here and appreciate your thinking and time and conveying how central a role NRCS and your programs play in helping people in communities all across the country address a diversity of conservation challenges, including notably wildlife habitat.
So you talked about all those different partnerships that you have with NRCS, and I was the beneficiary of one of those partnerships. And my first job as an adult out of grad school was working as a farm bill biologist in one of those USDA service centers. So I worked for the state of Kentucky, their wildlife agency, and drove their trucks. And my check was cut by them, but I worked inside an NRCS office and helped landowners kind of navigate that alphabet soup of conservation programs. So Bree, anything you want to wrap up with as we end this episode?
I appreciate you letting me come on and go through the alphabet soup with you. It's always a good reminding test of my own skills and my alphabet soup knowledge. I just would encourage anyone, don't be overwhelmed by the letters. Our service centers are out there. Our partner biologists are out there to help you wade through it. And so nobody should feel like they can't come in, ask the questions. We're here to provide that technical service, and you can find your local office on the web. That is by far the easiest way to find us. And hopefully we'll be able to see you in an office somewhere in the nation soon.
That's perfect. And we'll be sure to link to that how to find your local USDA service center in the show notes, along with a bunch of other resources that we've been talking about along the show. Bree, we really appreciate your time and expertise and sharing that with us here on the podcast. Listeners, if you like the show, please make sure to leave us a review, like, and subscribe, and tell your friends about us. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.